All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for bearing with us as we are getting started just a few minutes late today. I want to welcome you to today's interactive discussion, Counter-Terrorism and COVID-19, Gendered Perspectives, taking place today, Thursday, the 11th of March, 2021. This webinar is being recorded. The recording of today's webinar will be sent to all registrants and will also be hosted on the DCAF website. Before we start, I want to go over a few housekeeping issues. Interpretation is being provided for Arabic, French, Russian, and Spanish. I want to take this opportunity to remind all panelists to speak slowly and clearly so our interpreters can work effectively. During this webinar, all participants will be in listen-only mode with microphones muted. Throughout the discussion, at the end of the discussion, we will welcome questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, you can chat your question in using the chat feature, and we will read your question out loud to allow the panelists to respond. Please indicate who you are directing your question to. You may feel free to post your questions in English, Arabic, French, Russian, or Spanish, and we will do our best to get all questions asked. This webinar is coordinated through UN Women's global community of practice on women, peace, security, and humanitarian action, and is co-hosted with our colleagues at the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights and the DCAF Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. This webinar is the 6th in a series of joint webinars, which comes out of our collaboration on the Gender and Security Sector Reform Toolkit. We are very pleased to say that the entire toolkit will this month be published in Spanish and Arabic, as well as French in April, and all languages will be available on the DCAF and UN Women websites. We want to thank the government of the UK for its support for these translations. At the end of today's webinar, we will share a link to a brief 4-minute evaluation survey. We encourage all participants to provide your honest feedback on today's session. Your feedback is valuable and helps us as we continue to bring you webinars in this series. If you have any questions about this webinar, please feel free to send me a chat and I will do my best to respond to you as soon as possible. I would like to now introduce our moderator for today's session, Sarah Douglas, Deputy Chief for Peace and Security with UN Women. Sarah, you have the floor.
Thank you, Natasha. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to have so many colleagues from all around the world joining us this morning. Natasha's introduced me already, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Douglas, and I'm the Deputy Chief of Peace and Security at UN Women, New York. First of all, I'd like to thank DCAF and ODIHR for the collaboration on the toolkit, as well as on this excellent series of webinars that we've been hosting through our community of practice on women, peace and security and humanitarian action. These sessions have been very popular with dynamic and engaging discussions on topics that are crucial to gender and security sector reform. The Gender and Security Toolkit is really an excellent resource. I'd also like to highlight UN Women's Gender Mainstreaming in PVE Guidance Note, which is authored by Catherine Brown, who is on our panel discussion today. Together with the toolkit and UNODC's toolkit on gender and criminal justice responses to terrorism, there is a wealth of information to guide and inform UN and member states, and we will be sharing all of these resources in the chat. Today's discussion comes at an important time. The world is continuing to grapple with the unfolding COVID-19 pandemic, and yet we've had over a year now to witness and gather data and reflect on the ways in which authorities and civil society have responded to the pandemic. It is clear that whether on the ground or at the highest levels of office, women are leading effective COVID response. At the same time, it's been a tumultuous year. We have seen peaceful women-led protest movements and escalations of armed conflict. Under the fog of the pandemic, we've seen the emergence of a shadow pandemic of violence against women in the home, and some state actors militarizing COVID response efforts to effectively target and silence civil society, women leaders, and human rights defenders, and even democracy itself. Reports by civil society, OHCHR, and the Special Rapporteur indicate a correlation between the proliferation of counterterrorism laws and strategies and the shrinking of civic space and regress of women's rights. There is an increasing risk of co-opting women's rights in the interest of security approaches, including counterterrorism, instead of upholding women's rights as a right and state obligation. For UN Women, the pandemic has been a challenge, but also an opportunity. A challenge because many of the spaces where we have been advocating for the inclusion of civil society have been closed. Yet with physical events moving into virtual spaces, we have been creative and inclusive. One example of this is the Global Civil Society Consultation that UN Women organized on behalf of the Gender Working Group of the UN Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact, held last year from May to July. The consultation engaged more than 140 civil society representatives from 43 countries. The message that came out of this amazing interactive event was clear. Civil society demands that we all make sure human rights, women's human rights, gender equality, and democratic principles are at the core of counterterrorism responses. Discussions like that one and like this one today are crucial to inject a sense of reality and urgency into policy debates, like the upcoming review of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy that began this month, and also to inform programming and guidance for security actors on the ground. I'm delighted to moderate this discussion with a group of experts and colleagues like all of you to examine the specific gendered ways in which securitized responses to COVID-19 and counterterrorism responses are bleeding together at the peril of vibrant, open, and equal civil societies. As we mentioned earlier, there will be an opportunity to share your questions and comments based on today's discussion by sending your questions via the chat feature. We'll be monitoring your questions there and do our best to have the panelists respond to them. And please feel free to submit them in the languages that Natasha mentioned. With that, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today's discussion. And in the interest of time, I'll introduce them all now and then hand over to them one by one. So first we have Ms. Anne Charbord, legal advisor to the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of women human rights and the fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. Our second panelist is Dr. Catherine Brown, senior lecturer in Islamic Studies at the University of Birmingham. Dr. Brown is the leading author of UN's Women's Guidance Note that I just mentioned. And Dr. Amrita Kapoor, a gender expert with DCAF, the Geneva Center that Natasha mentioned. And unfortunately, as Natasha mentioned, our fourth panelist, Ms. Fauzia Ali, was not able to join us because of a bereavement, but that will give us a little bit more time for discussion, and we will definitely share the recording with her and continue to engage her and her organization in the follow-up. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Anne. Anne, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm very pleased to be joining you here today on behalf of the Special Rapporteur, Fanula Aloin, who is not the Special Rapporteur on Women's Human Rights and Counterterrorism, but just Counterterrorism and Human Rights. This is an extremely timely discussion and question. The focus of my remarks will go towards the elevation of the most acute issues faced on the ground. In her most recent report, which was presented to the Human Rights Council just last week, the Special Rapporteur acknowledged the profound impact of counterterrorism measures, including increased securitization and expanded counterterrorism and preventing and countering violent extremism regulation on women-led civil society and by women human rights defenders, as well as on women and family spaces. These harms are taking place from the direct targeting of women's civil society, particularly in those contexts most impacted by terrorism, to the ripple effect harms of overly broad, securitized, rights-absent approaches to CT and PVE that affect women's rights. Two examples, including countering the financing of terrorism, sanctions at the national and international level, and increased regulation or use of the family as a securitized tool of intelligence, policing, and counterterrorism. Given the limited time, I won't elaborate on each of these points fully, but I will make 3 points on the trends and the exacerbating effect of COVID-19. First, women human rights defenders are targeted at alarming rates for challenging the root causes of conflict, including corruption, governance deficits, access to land or resources, and the traditional notions of family and gender roles in their societies by both the state and non-state actors. And the grave threats women civil society actors face are in fact the most challenging in those countries that are most impacted by terrorism, where serious rule of law deficits, ongoing armed conflict, and lack of accountability and justice mechanisms are in place. The Secretary General reports on women, peace, and security since 2018 have precisely highlighted these points. As for COVID-19, the larger trend of an increased era of shrinking space and not only negative impacts of counterterrorism, but direct use of security and counterterrorism measures to silence public dissent and engagement has only been worsened during COVID-19. The Special Rapporteur has continued to report on the misuse of emergency powers during and under COVID-19 to silence dissent. She has supported with ICNL and ECNL, for example, the COVID-19 Civic Space Tracker, and has committed to updating her previous report on emergency powers to address these particular challenges. So that was my first point. My second point is that the particular dynamics of those ripple effects I mentioned in the counterterrorism space continue to be borne out of overly broad or ill-defined counterterrorism laws that then stretch out and make permissible secondary legislation and action. This, for example, can be seen in both countering the financing of terrorism and sanctions. On countering the financing of terrorism, once again, the Special Rapporteur's report highlights the negative impact, not just on so-called small-scale women's civil society work that is perceived as a risk to donors and financial institutions, but also as a direct tool to regulate divergent voices or challenging of traditional gender norms, which can result in backlash and governmental efforts to curb women's freedom of expression and association. This reality, paired with the harsh impact of material support to terrorism laws, fundamentally freezes the work of those actors, and in many cases, life-saving work, including for gender equality and women's rights. The impacts of counterterrorism sanctions and listing on women, girls, and families are equally far-reaching. They go beyond the effects of the individual listed and are likened to a civil death, affecting political, social, economic, and cultural rights, often with severe consequences, such as the right to work, to rent or to purchase a home, to travel, financial inclusion, social stigmatization, and many more. This is a hugely unexamined area for gendered impacts, and one that the Special Rapporteur will address and expand upon in the future. My third and final point underscores that COVID-19 affects all pre-existing gender inequalities, including in the counterterrorism space. And due to COVID-19 regulations, there is an even smaller space for visibility and recourse. Around the world, and colleagues with UN Women know this particularly well, the world of gender equality advocates and actors have mobilized to document the exacerbating effect of COVID-19 on all pre-existing gender inequalities. The gender dimensions follow from the unequal status of women in many societies and the layering of COVID regulation on top of existing inequalities. The gendered burdens are particularly felt in marginalized communities and communities of color, particularly acutely felt by the negative and disproportionate impact of the pandemic on certain communities. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. That was a very interesting and substantive presentation, and thank you for raising some of the impacts of sanctions targeted on terrorism into their broader community. And I think that's also what we advocate that gender analysis brings, is a better understanding of the dynamics in society that affect conflict and peace building as well. So now I would hand over to Dr. Brown for her intervention.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you so much, Anne, as well, for your intervention before. And much of what I have to say will echo your own comments and those of the Special Rapporteur. However, I would like to start by emphasizing that in this space of preventing violent extremism, significant steps forward have been made in regards to the inclusion of women and the representation of women, and acknowledging the gender differential impacts of PVE upon them and their families. In the guidance note, which we spent nearly 2 years researching and engaging with practitioners in order to come up with these findings and conclusions, we determined that there were 4 key principles that I want to highlight to you today, and to suggest the ways in which these principles have been detrimentally harmed by COVID-19 and state responses to it. The first of these principles for positive gender mainstreaming in regard to preventing violent extremism was about meaningful inclusion of women of all backgrounds and from all places. In order for preventing violent extremism measures to minimize the negative effects that Anne has so clearly outlined for us, they need to include women at all stages, including the design, the practice, and the evaluation of these programs. But what we are seeing with COVID-19 and the closing down of public spaces and the closing down of funding is a reversion back to male-dominated understandings and participation and practices within PVE. There has been a kind of reversal and a narrowing of focus, and to that extent, a limiting of the ways in which women are being included. The second principle that we identified in the guidance note was the importance of acquiring suitable evidence-based, one that is disaggregated according to gender, age, ethnicity, and other socioeconomic indicators. There had been some inroads in encouraging member states and civil society organizations and other international organizations into gathering and disaggregating the data in this way, so that then their programs and actions could be properly evaluated in relation to their gendered impacts. However, with restrictions on funding, with restrictions on the nature of the programs, and with the limitation of women's participation in PVE programming because of COVID-19, we are also seeing less emphasis being placed on the gathering of disaggregated data. And this will have significant long-term impacts on the evaluation and monitoring and the evidencing of both the positive and negative potential effects of counterterrorism legislation, policies, and practices. The third principle that we identified was around the need for PVE to be responsive to the needs of diverse women and to have that gender responsiveness built in, so that it wasn't just about acknowledging women's participation in either violent extremism or in preventing violent extremism, but actually responding to their needs. What we're finding instead, especially with the multiple effects of COVID-19, is that states and other international organizations are being very good at making claims with regards to gender inclusion, participation. We're seeing a lot of statements towards support for these efforts, but in practice, we are not seeing the changes that they are promising. What I would suggest to you is that COVID-19 is exacerbating a say-do gap. That is where there is a lot of goodwill at the higher levels, but it is not always being translated into practice. And that because of the nature of COVID-19 and the ways in which states are responding to that threat, that gap and that lack of responsiveness is becoming increasingly evident. The fourth principle that we identified was the need for preventing violent extremism as policies and programs, on the one hand, to be a whole of society approach, but on the other hand, to avoid the securitization and instrumentalization of other areas of life. We acknowledge that this is a fine balancing act. The reason, however, we stress the importance of it being a whole of society approach is recognizing the root causes of violent extremism are embedded within wider society, and that we must also recognize how violence at one level, perhaps for example in domestic violence, also then might connect through to extremist violence. But we are also mindful of the way in which a whole of society approach might lead to that instrumentalizing effect. And this has been well documented by the work of UN Women and the Special Rapporteur and others. And this balancing act is something that COVID-19 and state responses is shifting more and more towards the securitization and the instrumentalization of women's rights. This is problematic because what it is doing is it is suggesting that women's security only matters insofar as it matters to the state, and insofar as women's security can guarantee the security of existing regimes in the state, rather than acknowledging the needs for women's security and their empowerment in and of itself as a human right and good. The other concern that comes with this is that with the COVID-19 and the spaces that are opening up in the online world, but also the closing down of public spaces, is that space for dissent is closing. And one of the troubling things that I have noticed over the past year is a backlash against the very idea of women's rights as being important to countering violent extremism, or women's empowerment as being part and parcel of wider states' commitments, and instead a re-emphasization of the idea of the family first and sorry, my pronunciation in English is bad today even, this idea of the family first policies, and that if only the family was the secure space and women didn't need anything else but the family. And I think this is providing some real problems when we then add into that what the Special Rapporteur is noting, in which countering violent extremism is having negative effects on families as well. So we're seeing the family being instrumentalized and securitized by both sets of groups. And that, I think, is really important for us to notice. Finally, I would like to stress that in the guidelines that we produced, we also identified some areas of priority for PVE to work on. These included development programming, looking at areas of women's recruitment to violent extremism, questioning and looking into women's equality areas, security sector reform, working with communities and formers. And I would like to stress in particular the ways in which work with communities is being harmed through the nature of COVID-19 implementation strategies, and how this local level and the working, especially with marginalized communities, is being harmed through the ways in which states are implementing their COVID-19 strategies. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you for outlining those principles that we've learned through the development of the guidance note, and I think it'll help inform our discussion as we go forward. So next I'm going to turn to Armita, and as I mentioned, Armita has authored the UN ODC toolkit as well. And so I'd really like it if you can focus on some of the criminal justice responses. And also, Armita, we did have a couple of questions, and if it's okay with you, in the interest of time, maybe you could combine the first two questions and talk about the criminal justice responses and also some of the good practices that you've seen in terms of engaging the security sector and the PVE and CT architectures at the country level, and then we'll turn back to the other panelists with the same question. So over to you, Armita. Thank you so much.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. And it's a pleasure to be with you all today. And, you know, listening to the previous speakers, I was struck by, you know, the threads that we see that run through PV and counterterrorism as being really reflective of these macro trends and the challenges that we see with security and criminal justice institutions more broadly, in terms of both integrating a gender perspective and promoting gender equality, and really the fault lines becoming more and more evident when those two aspects are neglected. So just in terms of looking at counterterrorism specifically, I think it's already been mentioned by Anne, this flow-on effect of the funding restrictions and the fact that these funding restrictions combined with overly broad definitions of terrorism will disproportionately affect organisations that promote gender equality and women's rights, because we see that these are often grassroots on a small scale with a lower level of formal organisation, particularly when it comes to financial reporting. Years ago, actually, it's over a decade ago, I was fortunate enough to work with one of Fiona Weiler's predecessors, Martin Scheinen, who was the Special Rapporteur at that time, and shared and published the report on the gender dimensions of countering terrorism. And some of the effects that were described there, unfortunately, remain true today. And I think these were reflected in the recent report just last week that Anne referred to. And one of them, for example, is this privileging of a militarized response to terrorism, which means, of course, there's a diversion in terms of funds away from the types of initiatives that might actually go to the grassroots reasons behind violent extremism and radicalizing, for example, in relation to addressing structural gender inequalities and initiatives to promote gender equality. And this really resonates, I think, with not only what we've heard already today, but also what we know from COVID, that in fact the securitized response to COVID has also taken funds away from these types of initiatives that actually go towards the prevention rather than just the countering of the incidents. And I think in terms of, the militarization of the police, particularly in COVID, and the reversion that we saw and had just mentioned, is really reflective of the importance of challenging the institutional culture. When we're seeing this reversion, it's because we are looking at institutions that don't promote gender equality and integrate gender perspective both internally and externally, and there still exists an institutional prevalent culture which starts to really be reanimated or rise again in the context of these types of threats. And I think at the same time, we lose out because these gender blind efforts are less effective. We know that local women-led NGOs and community-based organizations all over the world have developed innovative and context-specific tactics to prevent recruitment to violent extremist groups. And their understanding of the dynamics and trends are more nuanced, they have more local credibility. And so in fact, their capacity to really I think leapfrog over some of the problems that state institutions continue to struggle with is exactly the type of capacity we need, and we're losing by this reversion in terms of the institutional responses being securitized and all of the flow-on effects that come from not really having a good governance structure in place. I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to respond to questions as we go through this discussion.
Amrita, thank you so much. That was really very interesting. And I think also points to the nuance that we need to have between the impulse or need to avoid securitizing women, peace, and security and women's rights, at the same time, the need to have very strong gender analysis. And I think your intervention really highlights that we have to be very sophisticated about pulling apart those two different strains. And I think also building on what Catherine said, the shadow pandemic that we've been seeing is obviously something that's occurring in all different realms and across different thematic areas, including in the radicalization of potential extremists, as well as state responses to that radicalization. So I think that was really helpful. So maybe now I can hand back to Catherine. We'll go in reverse order to highlight some of the examples that you see in terms of integrating gender into criminal law and processes, and any good practices or lessons learned. Back over to you, Catherine.
Thank you so much. I should caveat my response to this by stressing that I am not a lawyer and have no legal training. But what I have done is spent numerous now years working in relation to radicalization cases across Europe, and in particular recently focusing on the issue of women and children returning from conflict zones and the ways in which that is affecting narratives around gendered women's participation in violent extremism and the potential and perceived threats that they pose to national security. And what's interesting about the COVID-19 effect, if you will, on all of this is that the way in which COVID-19 is being presented as an additional threat that these women are allegedly creating by remaining within Iraq and Syria, but not necessarily assisting them in providing opportunities to minimize the spread of the virus within, say, the IDP camps. In addition, what we're seeing in relation to legal endeavors with regards to returning women and children, we are seeing slow steps for member states to facilitate the return of their citizens. Primarily here, I'm talking about citizens who belong to member states of the European Union or the UK, but these are very slow measures. And what we're also seeing is the racialization of this, where those who might hold dual citizenship are becoming doubly affected by these numerous measures. So I think what's really important here as well is to recognize the way in which it is not just gender, but also gender plus race that really matters in the way in which states are responding to the various issues legally and in relation to citizenship deprivation, but also in how they're responding to women's situations within the IDP camps and those of children. So I really want to just draw out that question of intersectionality. Some of the good practices, though, that we are beginning to see are efforts towards including rehabilitation efforts for women affiliated or associated in some way with terrorist organizations within Iraq and Syria, for rehabilitation efforts to happen in country. And I think that that's a good kind of halfway house that is beginning to happen. And the second thing are efforts with regards to the criminal justice space in gathering evidence and the evidence chain, and really working with the security and justice systems in Iraq and Syria to find ways of maintaining an evidence chain and working that through to find appropriate levels of jurisdiction. And I think this has been particularly hard for women, where it's not always as clear-cut what their participation may or may not have been. And I think states are being clearer about the criminal offences that women may or may not be charged with, and clearer about the necessary evidence in relation to that. And I would suggest that that's a slow step forward. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, and thank you also for raising the intersectionality, because I think with such a complex issue that cannot be understated, and as well the perhaps ethnic and religious identities also that play into the dynamics. And I think also the interesting comment about how states sort of know what to do in a sense with the criminal elements, with the men essentially, and it's so much harder where women's roles are much more are multiple. You know, they may be victims as well as perpetrators. Even at the same time, they can be victims and perpetrators. So I think that's part of the reason that it's so confusing or counterintuitive for member states to know how to deal with. So back over to Anne for the same question about good practices and some lessons learned.
Sure. So I think first and foremost, what we need to underscore is that the rights-based approaches that are necessary for ensuring that counterterrorism legal processes and practices are rooted in respect for the rule of law and human rights. The state of affairs demonstrates long-standing questions around legal certainty in many national level processes that rely on overly broad definitions of terrorism, discriminatory approaches that focus on particular communities, and therefore outcomes that are not only negatively affect the individual subject of the measure, which in some cases is a woman, but also affect women as family and community members and civil society. What we see is that we have a profound global problem in the abuse that follows from overly broad definitions of terrorism, extremism, and security. And also I want to underscore that these terms are often used interchangeably. Secondly, we need to have a conversation about what capacity building and integrating a gendered approach looks like in the national security and counterterrorism institutions. As colleagues here have experienced or can attest to, given the gender mainstreaming work in the security sector, making the gendered harms of counterterrorism visible and prompting action remains a very difficult task. I say this not because we struggle to document the vast harm and the very negative impact, but because of the remarkably challenging normative space where we seek to make the harm seen. Both within the UN as well as in global and national spaces, there is an enormously permissive space for counterterrorism, a permissive space which enables and facilitates abuse and doesn't fundamentally address the conditions that produce violence, including gender inequality. That is, as the Special Rapporteur noted last week, national security and counterterrorism sectors operate with an acute diversity crisis and methods and practices that function within the institutionalized culture of discrimination, misogyny, and gender bias that perpetuate gender inequality and cultures of impunity, while rewarding a very particular set of traditionally masculine traits and behaviors, including technocratic knowledge, justification of the use of force, decisiveness over moral considerations, and masculinist protection narratives. In her recent report, the Special Rapporteur made specific recommendations to member states. These include the need to urgently address the need for close scrutiny and oversight by states of sanctions and the misuse of sanctions and listing processes to target civil society and persons exercising rights protected by law, as well as addressing the encroachment of counterterrorism actors and intelligence information in family laws and courts at the national level, including regulating these interactions and recognizing the professional obligations of family and care professionals in these spaces to preserve and to protect the rights of the child and due process norms under international law. I think I'll stop here for this specific question. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Anne. And we'll do the reverse order now and turn back to you for the last set of questions. Throughout the pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen the power of women's leadership, whether at the head of state level or at the local level, where we've seen women peace builders becoming the first line of education and response. We also saw this extensively in the Ebola response several years ago. So this really speaks to what we champion in the Women, Peace and Security agenda, that women are powerful agents of change and need to be taken seriously. From your perspectives, what do you think women, peace and security can play in terms of embedding collaboration by governments with and respect for civil society in national PVE and CT policies, including by avoiding the securitization of women's rights and women, peace and security, which we've been discussing, and avoiding falling into that perilous trap. So maybe, Anne, if you could just take a couple minutes to reflect on that, and then we'll hand back to Amrita and then Catherine to respond. We're switching up the order to keep everybody engaged.
Sure. So here, I think we need to consider some of the most recent dialogues exploring the impact the counterterrorism and preventing and countering violent extremism agenda has had on the space held by the Women, Peace and Security agenda. The mandate of the Special Rapporteur is concerned about the commodification of the Women, Peace and Security agenda by highly permissive counterterrorism and violent extremism agendas that do not serve women's interests well. The Women, Peace and Security agenda is one that should be rooted in demilitarization, in transformative feminist approaches to ending conflict and to sustaining peace. The Women, Peace and Security agenda holds an important potential in these spaces to hold its ground and suggest that there are approaches that are wholesale distinct from counterterrorism and preventing and countering violent extremism, and more likely to end or to transform the conditions that produce violence. The Secretary General situating the Women, Peace and Security agenda, for example, as a prerequisite to sustaining peace and preventing conflict demonstrates its power as an agenda and also as a movement. It's regrettable, though, that we are still very concerned at the co-option of the Women, Peace and Security agenda and the stifling of its broader aims as it is taken up by counterterrorism actors and in counterterrorism and preventing and countering violent extremism spaces. The Women, Peace and Security agenda can be a very powerful tool to challenge the exceptionalism approaches to terrorism and to violent extremism that create a rights-free and a highly permissive environment for lack of rule of law and human rights realization.
Thanks so much for that, Anne. Now back over to Amrita to answer the same question.
Thanks, Sarah. And I'm going to pick up a little bit of the threads that have already been said. I think what was said by Anne previously around this importance of transforming traditionally masculine cultures within the security sector is absolutely critical, and it's an integral part of achieving the women, peace and security agenda. What we see is that in the last 20 years, and last year was a point of reflection on the agenda, we see that in fact, that's the part that hasn't yet been achieved, where we actually dismantle the institutional, structural and procedural barriers to inclusivity and diversity. And it's that aspect which is going to be critical to not just respond to terrorism, to violent extremism, but also to ensure that the securitized response to COVID, for example, doesn't lead to all of these compounding rights violations. And I think I'm going to talk a little bit of a few examples. I think one of them that we've seen, for instance, is that if you have community policing in terms of a response where in fact you're building partnerships, the fact that to do this effectively, we know that police institutions have found that having women meaningfully participate, having women in leadership positions is critical to be able to sort of bridge that gap with community, to be able to be more effective in preventing violent extremism. That's been true, for example, in Norway. It's also been true in Kosovo and a number of other countries. I just wanted to touch upon one other element, which is how do we see this dialogue around responding to these threats, and the fact that we've got this state ownership often within security sector institutions that is heavily masculine in its narratives and its approaches. And what that means is we're not really looking at prevention or resilience to violent extremism per se, but rather sensitization, anticipation and responses. And I think this is that fundamental disconnect between an institutionally dominant type of approach versus that true collaboration where you're engaging with diverse communities in the broader society to be able to see what it is that promotes community resilience. I did want to share a couple of good practices in response to the criminal justice responses, because I didn't do that with your previous question, and I think one of the reasons I think it's appropriate to mention is just because we do have good practices within justice and security institutions that can be extrapolated from or transferred across. It's not that they don't exist, it's just that we see that there are these cultural barriers to really integrating them. I think one of them, for example, resonates with Anne's comment about this balance, where we're not stereotyping women as less culpable or capable, and at the same time we're not criminalizing them or recognizing, we have to recognize that they might be disproportionately differently impacted by criminalization and those associated approaches. So we need to look at gender sensitive applications of mens rea tests in criminal prosecutions. In terms of the intersectionality argument, I think what's really clear is similar to what I've said in terms of security sector institutions. The same thing occurs with external relations, which is that in fact we do base the approaches on behavioral characteristics rather than the type of profiling that we see is so problematic. There are a range of other sort of initiatives which I think have been particularly effective across different countries in terms of being a more sensitized approach for criminal justice responses. And I think, again, in terms of the women, peace and security agenda, part of this is around recognizing how do we respond in a way that we're not exacerbating or compounding the harms, and indeed making it harder to achieve the women, peace and security agenda in the long run. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think those are very good examples that help to illuminate. So Catherine, back over to you.
Thank you so much. So my thoughts were about the first part of your question about women's leadership and where this can really benefit the WPSA agenda. Insofar as one of the things that COVID-19 we've really seen is the rapid increase and take up of far-right ideologies and extreme nationalist ideologies as well, that often tap into anti-feminist and anti-women rhetorics as well, which also then connect to a range of conspiracy theories that are around vaccination or about public health conditioning. And one of the things that I think has really shone through as terms of women's leadership is pushing back on actually the securitization of the COVID-19 response and returning it to being a question of public health, and also responding to the COVID-19 kind of conspiracy theories in the far right and challenging a lot of that. I think for the WPS agenda, something that we really need to be mindful of, having spent so long responding, especially in the global north, to questions around Islamist terrorist groups and those who claim inspiration from religious movements, is recognizing also how this also impacts on the far right and far right extremist groups, and they too are manipulating these spaces to their agendas that necessarily harm women's rights as well. And so for me, the leadership that we need to see is also in that space. And that leadership can come forward both at the national level, where we see women's leaders pushing back against extreme patriotism and nationalism that then links into the far right, but also connecting back through communities and using women's power and voices to really challenge some of that normalization of far right discourses.
Yeah, I think that's also a very important point, and making the link between the far right and other ideological sources of CT and PVE. We see, obviously, we've been noting at UN Women for some time that misogyny seems to be a commonality between all of those groups. So I think, and also the reaction against civil society. So I think that's also very important to bear in mind. Okay, thank you so much, panelists, for really exciting and concrete and dynamic interventions. I think we've covered so many ideas and topics. Before we open to the participants, I would like to give the floor to a couple of our discussants. The first one being Iman Syed Taha, who many of you know, who is our policy specialist on this topic at UN Women. So Iman, a couple of minutes to give some reflections, please.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you so much to our panelists. I think the points raised today are all super pertinent to the ongoing negotiations between member states on the text of the 7th review of the global strategy. And one of the issues that we've been trying to push forward from UN Women's side is like, how can the new text respect the commitments outlined in the Women, Peace and Security agenda? This has been an ongoing debate in terms of as one of the panelists mentioned, the co-opting of the agenda. And there is some also lashback on how the peace and security framework already cover the rights of women in peace and security context, and what is the relationship between gender equality and women's rights to counter terrorism. So in some aspects, I think the community of practice and the UN is advanced in the sense of research, of dialogue with the communities, collaboration with think tanks to provide thorough gender analysis, institutional analysis, the interlinkages of gender in security sector reform, whole of society approaches, whole of government approaches. But that doesn't necessarily, at least from my perspective, reflect in the discourse and dialogue among member states and intergovernmental processes that are looking into the global framework of counterterrorism. So in a way, we still have a lot of work to be done in terms of advocacy by basically, if possible, gathering the data from the ground, a challenge that Dr. Brown did allude to, but also the voices from civil society at the grassroots level. Sarah mentioned, we did have this global consultation together with partners of the UN system and UNOCT. And these are, and then the research that we also collaborate with different entities, including also with Dr. Brown. These kinds of efforts are, I think, are still relevant, that we do more of that, to be honest, and to advocate more through these kinds of platforms, especially in the future, bringing in member states from the security sector side because of issues that are related to the security sector institution in and of itself, and then the culture, and try to increase the interface between the great work that we've been doing as a community of practice from different places and the security actors in these member states, so as the policy is translated into a reality through frameworks, through trying to impact the institutional culture of the security sector and so forth. So thank you so much for this very interesting discussion. I'm looking forward to continue this discussion and continuing our collaboration going forward, and especially this year because it's a big year for the counterterrorism in the Security Council. And I hope like our good work collectively can inform these discussions into a direction that can align better the practices within the human rights law and the rule of law and due processes in country on the ground. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Iman. And I think your point also about how from the UN perspective, I mean, we have a lot of different stakeholders on the group, on the line, on the webinar today, but I think we are very keen as UN Women, and I think many of the operational entities feel the same way, to make sure that this work we're doing at the policy level starts to inform programming and implementation on the ground in a much more meaningful way. So I think that's where we really need to focus our energies going forward. So before I hand over to Kate Fitzpatrick from UNODC, I just want to remind colleagues to please enter your questions into the chat. We'd like to read them all in one go and then turn back to the panelists in the interest of time. So please do so, and you can send them in your languages and we'll ask the interpreters to translate them for us. So Kate, over to you for reflections from the floor.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to comment as well. I mean, I think the panelists really laid out many of the challenges so well, and we highlighted some of these same issues. We actually had a Crime Congress special event this week that focused on the issue of gender and terrorism as well, in which several member states highlighted some of the issues they're currently dealing with. And as the world has shifted their focus to COVID, I think some of the issues of the role of women in counterterrorism efforts has kind of been a bit neglected. But as Mon was just saying, I actually had the same thought that this is kind of our opportunity this year to kind of, with the biennial review of the CT strategy, to re-emphasize these, at least in our own policy documents, to kind of reshift the focus to the importance of dealing with these issues. And I think the Special Rapporteur's recent report is kind of a good document to kind of lay out many of the issues we all face. But I mean, the panel of experts today, to me, has really been so thorough in addressing so many of the issues that we all see on the ground. So nothing more from my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kate, and also thank you very much to UNODC for your partnership on this topic. We really value the work that we're doing at the policy level, but also programmatically in West Africa and Central Asia. So we have one question from Megan about asking if there are any strong examples of oversight of CT measures by parliaments or ombuds institutions or national human rights institutions in a way that is gender responsive. And before I hand up back, there are a few more great questions from the colleagues who are attending. So another one from Hamzata is how to take into account the aspects affecting women, security, justice, gender integration, and inclusion in humanitarian action. And then another question from Dr. Arif. Do you think child soldiers should be in the security agenda from 1325 from a gender perspective? So children associated and affected by terrorist groups, how do they fit into our discussion? We did talk about intersectionality in terms of race, and ethnicity and religion, but we have not yet talked about youth or children, so the age aspects, other forms of intersectionality, as well as we have not talked about sexual orientation, which of course is a very big issue in some of the countries and contexts on the ground. So I don't see any more questions. Perhaps I can then turn back. We'll switch up the order again. If I can turn back perhaps to Amrita to do the first stab, and then we can do Anne and Catherine. And then if anyone has other questions, please come in and put them in the chat. So Amrita, would you like to come back on any of those questions or the reflections made by Iman and Kate?
Yeah, I think I'll just keep my initial comments brief because I think the others will have lots to add on this. I think in terms of the civilian, so oversight, one of the interesting factors I think in terms of a form of civilian oversight is where indeed you do have that type of consultation with civil society on preventing violent extremism from beginning to end. And that's what I was sort of alluding to when I referred to minority community policing projects, where those are examples where indeed that civil society input has been much more of a partnership and therefore perform some type of oversight role. But I will let the others respond to the sort of the parliamentary oversight element of it. I think in terms of children, yes, so actually the UNODC handbook that looks at gender dimensions of criminal justice responses for terrorism also talks a little bit around children and what some of the sort of special, needs and particular responses, particularly when they're returning and they're accompanying their mothers, for example. So, what are the alternatives to the types of either the charges that, for example, their mothers might face, the types of rehabilitation, reintegration programs, and how that actually incorporates the sort of the children involved in those. So I would actually sort of recommend looking through that handbook because it does have a few of those. As far as I know, I am not familiar with a specific sort of handbook that targets children in particular, but I do think the handbook I'm referring to does include references to children, particularly in relation to where they're returning and how do we respond sort of more constructively than has been the case in many countries. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, Anne, over to you, particularly on the Parliament's question, perhaps.
Sure. On oversight, I mean, I think it's clear that what we're seeing is a lack of oversight of counterterrorism and counterterrorism measures, but also of preventing and countering violent extremism measures. And that might be the case. In a way, it's even more acute because of the fluidity of these measures. We see a lack of oversight at international level, at every international level. Also, I mean, not just the UN, the Security Council, and the counterterrorism bodies and institutions, but also through all of these various measures that are the soft law measures that are being adopted, and that then translate into national legislation, which are incredibly difficult to monitor at international level, but also, frankly, at national level. I mean, I'm not aware of any national level mechanism, and I would be, if participants could pinpoint to a few for me, that would be incredibly useful, because I'm certainly not aware of any oversight mechanism at national level that would actually grasp the massive impact that counterterrorism measures have on all human rights and certainly not of any that would specifically focus on women's right or have a gender perspective integrated into them. And in any event, I think that the mechanisms that we have would fail to grasp the very important impact that all of these measures have on women's rights. I mean, this is global in its, so let me maybe just go back and circle back to a point I made earlier. The making the gendered harms of counterterrorism visible and prompting action remains an incredibly difficult task. We know the impact, we have a knowledge of what they are, but making these visible and making their breadth visible remains a very serious challenge. If I may just say a word on children. I think what we're seeing when it comes to the rights of children and the links with children and designated terrorist groups, we see what we see in many of these in the terrorism and counterterrorism sector, which is that it kind of takes over all of the principles that we have known. It seems that when we're looking at these individuals who are detained in the camps at the moment, states have completely forgotten that they must treat children, including children that are related to or associated with terrorist groups, primarily as victims when they're devising responses, including counterterrorism responses, and that their best interest should always be a primary consideration. The states should, whether these children are or not in these camps, they should ensure their rights, even when the child's interests conflicts with the state's perceived security interests. Children should simply not have to carry the terrible burden of simply being born to individuals that are related to or associated with designated terrorist groups. Maybe also just to point on the question of women that was touched upon, the women that are associated with terrorist groups. The mandate has always tried to be very clear that association with terrorist groups is highly complex. When it comes to women and girls, states always have to be mindful of the potential for coercion, for co-option, for grooming, for trafficking, for enslavement, for sexual exploitation when they're examining their agency. And this necessitates the undertaking of individualized assessments. And again, because it's almost as if because these issues are being looked at through the terrorism lens, we are forgetting absolutely basic principles. It's sort of taking over very basic rights and ways of doing things that we were used to in other contexts. So we've been sort of boxed in to this counterterrorism framework. And I think the objective here is maybe to get out of it and to reframe the issues. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Now, Catherine, you're supposed to be next, but if it's okay, in the interest of time, because we only have a little more than 15 minutes left and a bunch of more questions came up. So is it okay if I read those questions and then ask you to respond, and then we can hand back to the other panelists?
Absolutely, that's fine.
Okay, great. Okay, wonderful. So we have one question about how to ensure coordination of the partners intervening in the field of women, peace, and security. This is definitely a challenge, I can say, from Unwomen's perspective. Another question from Amani. Don't you think more should be done concerning sustainable development goals? Working more on rethinking our goals, particularly in terms of goals 5 and 16 on gender equality and peace and justice. That's from Amani Jarar. Another question from Jamilia. In our community, women are often radicalized by coercion or deception of men in the family, and activities carried out by civil society are also often perceived by government agencies as directed against national security. If you have examples of positive practices of interaction of women's organizations in this process, that would be useful to share. So with those additional questions, Could I please ask, just checking, okay. Could I please ask Catherine to intervene? And I think specifically the question of the national institutions was directed at you, but if you have any reflections on the questions I just read out, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think the challenge of coordination and working with different national partners and civil society is a huge challenge across the board, especially when we have slightly competing mandates through different organizations and institutions. And in addition, different ideas about what success might look like. And I think that can be a real challenge for coordination when different agencies and different partners have different ideas about what the ultimate goal is. I thought Anne's reminder that ultimately the goal of countering terrorism and countering violent and preventing violent extremism should be for a sustainable, inclusive, transformative feminist peace is a really helpful reminder. But in practice, I would find that those goals are often falling short and often conflated to short-term goals. And that also is where the coordination problems happen, and also where there might be tension, if I may, with responding appropriately in humanitarian interventions, but also with sustainable development goals, where the time scale are so different in both of these. So in humanitarian interventions, there is often the need to have immediate responses. And in sustainable development, we're often looking at much more longer term. And yet governments in all of this are demanding a kind of a measurable security effectiveness response that covers both of these. And I think that is something that we need to work very hard on, is about identifying what the goal is, how that can be measured and observed and evidenced, but also in a way that responds to some of these questions about that normative element. In my opening remarks, I suggested that there is a degree of goodwill in terms of women's equality and promoting these things. We are seeing some member states saying the right types of things. But I do sometimes feel that this is something they might say internationally, but not domestically. And so there are multiple audiences coming to play here. And also, again, seeing that translating through down the different levels is also important. And if I could give an example in the UK, where officially the counter-terrorism legislation and all legislation is meant to undergo a gender equality impact assessment. And yet somehow they miraculously determined that there are no gender biases in any of our counter-terrorism or countering violent extremism policies, programs, or practices, which seems counterintuitive to the evidence before us. But they're able to do this because of the way in which they phrase certain questions and the way they measure gender equality in terms of pure numbers or very direct harms. And this also points to Anne's question about how do we have oversight for the soft measures, for the administrative measures that families themselves are facing. So another example, again from the UK, that comes to mind is the way that often women are not necessarily prosecuted under terrorism-related offences, but they're prosecuted under other ranges of offences. For example, kidnapping children. So if they take their children to conflict zones and return, they don't get convicted of terrorism, but kidnap. And you might think, well, okay, it's an easier thing to charge with. You understand it from a prosecution perspective, but actually this has a significant effect on the resources made available to the women once they're interred. So they don't get access to the same rehabilitation programs, but also we can't measure the effect in the same way as if they were actually prosecuted in terrorism-related offences, should that also be appropriate. So there are some real issues that we need to think about here and try and influence the way our national legislators, when they do provide oversight, really get them to rethink some of those indicators and the measures that they have to capture these complex issues.
Thank you so much. And I think we've also seen that in other examples, like with trafficking victims, they may have some, even here in the States, like some of their charges vacated, but not accompanying charges. So then it kind of becomes, the efforts to vacate their charges becomes sort of pointless if they're still getting charged for other things. Okay, now before I hand it back to the other two panelists, we've had a few more questions come in. So again, I'm going to read them out, hoping that you can answer them because we're running short on time. So there's a question from Gabriella. And she says, this might be a bit provocative, which I already like the sound of that question, but I find that the definition of terrorist is largely decided at the political level and based on who has legitimacy by use of force. But on the ground, working in DDR, things are much more fluid. How can we as practitioners make sure to support ex-combatants, especially women who fall into that terrorist category? Also noting that women can be politicized and join these groups because they are empowered and not always because they are forced. That's a very good point. And then another one from Natasha. What is the role of professionals compared to politicians in this area in your countries? Also a very good question about the politicization of this topic. Okay, so why don't I hand back to Amrita to answer any of those questions, the second round of questions that have been read out.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. Those questions are clearly substantial enough for a whole other webinar. I am going to start with this, drawing on some of DCAF's recent work. It's a 6-country review of the frameworks within which security forces are engaging and preventing violent extremism in West and Central Africa. And the reason I mention this is because I think it goes to the heart of what we're talking about in terms of that dialogue of what's understood of preventing violent extremism, and that the consequence of this being sort of very state dominated, and therefore we see all of the problematic, not just masculine sort of narratives and approaches, but also those that might be lacking an intersectional lens, is that it leads to this focus on intelligence building. What we found here is that the preliminary findings suggest that there are still these challenges around how do we both transform the institutional cultures and practices to be able to do better, and at the same time enhance the capacity of other actors to be able to both oversee and engage in a more collaborative way. So some of those types of trends, and I'd say watch this space because we'll be publishing that piece soon. And I think it goes to sort of many of the trends that we've been talking about today. I wanted to mention in terms of the way we look at criminal charges and women and when women are detained is, again, the importance of that gender analysis. So just looking at a good practice, which is, we know, for example, in terms of financing and support, you can tailor your mens rea test so that if you're reckless, that's one thing, but if you didn't have the knowledge or you couldn't have known, then in fact you're actually a bit more nuanced in your analysis of where and why you would exercise the discretion to charge in the first place. And I think that's where the gender analysis at the beginning of these types of investigations is so critical. So if you've got gender blindness in that context, you're going to continually compound the problems and obviously not at all address some of the deeper problems as to why people might radicalize or join violent extremist groups in the first place. I really like the comment around DDR and this question of fluidity. I've been working in Yemen, where some of you might know that Ansar Allah was designated a terrorist organization, and now that designation's been removed. And the flow-on consequences are just extraordinary. So I think that one of the challenges in that type of context is that we're also dealing with this very pressing, and this came up from another question, the humanitarian question of what we actually want is people to lay down their arms. And so the what's on the table is actually much more of a nuanced conversation around what do we do now to be able to promote some type of sustainable peace along the lines of what Anne described, and at the same time recognize that we need to keep the door wedged open so that there is the possibility of accountability in the future. And I think in terms of this sort of very fluid nexus in the armed conflict context, I do think it's way too complex for this webinar when we've got a few minutes left, but it is one which has very specific gender dimensions because of all of those financial, regulatory flow-on effects that we see that have disproportionate and different effects on women compared to, in some of these cases, and as in Yemen, the 99% of armed actors who are men. So I think that that there are definitely gender dimensions there that are not well articulated either in the peace building dominant narrative, and also then how that links to this sort of context of violent extremism. So I've just probably suggested that there are more problems in questions than answers, but I think that sort of goes to how substantive those questions were. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Amrita. And I really appreciate the example that you provided about Yemen, because also that case shows us not only those dynamics at the local level, but also how the international dynamics at the very highest level are influencing the programmatic and policy decisions that are being taken, and the way that the shifts in the international community's priorities can impact the lives of individuals, whether they're considered a DDR participant or a terrorist, I think is a very big difference in the life of an individual. So that was a very concrete example. Okay, we have just a few minutes remaining, and I would like to hand back to Anne, but one more question came in, and I'm going to ask it because Anne is representing a mandate holder. So we had a short question came in asking about the impact of this topic on women living under occupation. So if you could perhaps answer that one, as well as anything else you would like to reflect from the second round of questions from the excellent audience that we have today. Over to you, Anne.
Sure. If you don't mind, maybe I'll start with the definition, the provocative definition question, because of course this is an issue that is at the core of the mandate that I work for. There's a reason why there's no definition of terrorism at the international level, and it is indeed very problematic that there is an entire framework around a concept that has no definition at international level. So states are asked to adopt legislation and take all these measures around something that is left to them to define. So what we've seen, and this is an issue that's been addressed since the very first report of the first mandate holder in 2005, what we've seen is that the definitions at national level are incredibly broad, they're incredibly vague, they lack in legal certainty. And that means that when states want to include women, they do. When they want to include civil society, they do, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, anybody that they don't like at the end of the day can be included in the definition of terrorism. And maybe just one word on this issue of returnees and repatriations. I mean, what we've seen is that states are dealing with this very differently. Some states do not prosecute at all. Some states prosecute women just like men on charges of membership or travel, etc., quite systematically. But even when when charges aren't pressed, when there's no prosecution at national level, what we see is a very dangerous trend of these women returnees being placed, or the risk that they're placed under constant monitoring and surveillance, that they're placed on lists because they have gone, so they're not prosecuted, but then they are constantly monitored. And this could last for a very long time. So this is a very insidious way of doing things somehow. So that's what I wanted to say. I don't know if there's anything else I'm supposed to be answering.
Any reflections on women under occupation?
No, not specifically. I'll leave that to the other panelists.
Okay, we have less than 5 minutes remaining. Would any of the other panelists like to say a final word? 30 seconds, final word from any of the participants? From the panelists, rather? Okay, I think we've covered so much ground during this discussion, and it's been so interesting to me to also reflect on how the policies and guidelines that we are developing at the global level, including the toolkit, how they apply in the very complex settings in which we are trying to apply them. And I think this is going to be an ongoing discussion because this is still a relatively new area of work. And although, of course, we see the importance and the relevance and the need and the demand for the Women, Peace, and Security agenda to influence decision-making in this realm as well as all other realms to improve security and peace and justice, I think we still have so many unanswered questions, like you said, and the fact that we don't even have a definition of terrorism. We do not have any sense of specifically what a gender responsive or successful intervention, let's say, would really look like, because I think we still have a very strong sense of what not to do, maybe less of a strong sense of what needs to be done. And I think that's where we need to continue to work together to try to identify where those good practices are and document them and share them across the world to all the different countries that are dealing with this very challenging issue. So I would like to really thank all of you for this excellent discussion. I would like to again thank ODIHR and DCAF, UNODC, and the Special Rapporteur's Office for being our very strong partners in this endeavor, both specifically related to the toolkit, but also more broadly in terms of our other policy and operational work. I'd like to also thank Iman for her thematic leadership, and also Natasha for being an excellent, the best webinar organizer and host in the business. And she always deals with all of these very complex events in such a seamless way that yields so many good results and so much added value to all of us who participate. So it's really been a wonderful discussion, and I think we have so many ideas and action points to take forward. I would also like to remind everybody to be sure to take the survey. This survey helps us identify where these webinars should improve and what we're doing well, and also helps us continue to justify the provision of this service to our organization and make sure we have the resources to carry on these types of learning events. So Natasha has sent the link in the chat, and she'll also follow up with an email to all of you to take the survey as soon as you can. And a special thanks and recognition of our excellent panel and their very strong work. And also one more word of thanks to Megan Bastick from DCAF, who's been tirelessly championing the toolkit and making sure that it gets finalized and taken forward. So have a wonderful day, colleagues. Thank you so much for all your time, insight, for sharing, and for all the work that you're doing to take the Women, Peace, and Security agenda forward. Thank you.